Welcome to the lecture for Psych 350. This is Dr. Fiala. I'll be talking about the trait approach to understanding personality. And notice kind of a difference here. We talk about the trait approach and not trait theory. Although some aspects of the trait approach are consistent with what we conceptualize as theory, many aren't, and there's not necessarily a coherent theory of that defines the trait approach. It's more a way of looking at personality and less of a kind of full structural model for understanding the components of personality. Start off by talking about some of the assumptions of the trait approach. One, we'll begin with a definition of a trait, right? That it's a dimensional characteristic of an individual. For now, focus on the characteristic. Right? What is that? What's a characteristic? Right? It's a distinguishing quality. Something about an individual that might be different in him or her than in someone else. Right? And not a physical characteristic, but something about their personality. Right? The way the person acts, thinks, or feels that might be different than another individual. Pretty much anything you can think of as a descriptive feature of someone, of what someone's like, without something that's physical, could be considered a personality trait. Right? Try to think of something. Oh, he's so or she's so shy, inquisitive, bold, nettlesome, flamboyant, charming, on and on. These are all potentially personality traits. Right? A trait is often also thought of as what we call a latent variable. This means that there's some truth of what you or what a person is like that's not always obvious. It's latent, it's hidden. Right? It's there, but it may be obscured by other variables. For example, the situation. Right? So you may be a really friendly person. That's kind of your trait. That's this latent variable that drives much of your behavior, a truth behind your behavior. But in any given situation, when somebody observes you, they may not see that friendliness because maybe you're in a situation that doesn't call for it. Right? But that there's still some truth there that could be detected. Right? So the trait is kind of the true you that isn't always reflected. Okay. Trait theory doesn't look at personality types. Right? It's really a departure from thinking about individuals as falling into one of a set of categories. Right? Some people will try to turn trait theory into a typology and say, oh, shyness, so you're a shy type. And kind of really the true trait approach says, no, don't do that. Nobody is the shy type. Maybe more or less shy. Right? And you even notice that the author of your chapter falls back into the language of typology many times, using words like categorize, talking about which group a person falls in. And that's partly because that's just the nature of the way our minds work. It's easier for us to understand the world if we categorize it. But the trait approach pushes you to think in a little more complicated way about people, and in a dimensional sense. Right? And it suggests that traits are dimensional. Right? And this means that instead of a category, like a category of shy or not shy, it's all about a level of shyness, ranging from low to high or not at all to very much. Right? And a further assumption of the trait approach is these dimensional traits on which people can vary, they're normally distributed in a population. Okay, so you have to think back to any kind of stats class you might have ever taken, and what does it mean for something to be normally distributed? What's a normal distribution? Well, you remember that kind of bell curve thing, right? Well, what does that mean? It means that, well, there's some average, some typical level of every trait. An average level of shyness, an average level of openness to experience, an average level of friendliness, an average level of inquisitiveness. And there's no value given to that from trait approach in terms of, being average, being in the middle is good, or being above or below the middle is good or bad. It's just there's a statistical, typical, most frequently occurring level of each trait. Right? And that some people are more of that trait, and some people are less of that trait. And that the distribution of people in the population, when measuring that trait, is normally distributed. So we can look at the normal curve and say, okay, well, about 5% of the population is 2 standard deviations above the mean or below the mean on any given trait. And that's what normally distributed means. We can make predictions about how many people are a certain way. right? Okay. Another assumption of the trait approach is that traits are stable over time. Right? So if you're high in extroversion today, then you'll probably be high in extroversion tomorrow and 10 years from now. And if we measure, just one instance now, in one instance 10 years from now, we may not see the exact same level of extroversion. But that's because we're using poor measurement approaches. If we make 20 measurements now and average them, and 20 measurements in the future and average them, and then compare those two averages, they'll probably be pretty similar. Right? Because again, think about this trait as this average level. It's this typical truth around which you vary. So if we're going to look for any kind of stability, we've got to get an average of several observations. That being said, trait theorists do acknowledge generally that personality can change. Right? Change in trait level can occur, but it does so usually over many years, and typically not drastically. So it's subtle and slow. So if you're a really shy person and you want to be more outgoing, you can become more outgoing if you push yourself. And there's lots of other psychological theories that talk about how you can make that happen. And trait theory doesn't have anything to say about how you can make it happen, but it just says, yeah, it can happen, but it's slow. That traits are resistant to change. So they're stable over time, and they're also thought to be stable across situations, right? So this means that you're not traded. Your traits aren't situation specific. It's just that, oh, you're just friendly here. That and that may be, well, I'm friendlier here than I am here, but overall you have some average level of friendliness. So if you're friendly, or let's say if you're greedy when it comes to sharing your marshmallows with your cousins, you probably won't drop your spare change in the Salvation Army bucket outside the mall. That's what a trait theorist would predict, right? That traits manifest themselves across situations. And again, there are exceptions, but on average, in general, you'll see stability. Again, just like we talked about time, looking at one instance and one instance, you may not see stability across time. Same thing with situations. One time I was like this, another time I was like this. But traits there say, in general, if you're like this, if you're greedy, if you're friendly, if you're curious here, then you're liable to be that way in other situations. Okay. So how does trait theory trait approach differ from other theories? One, not focused on predicting individual behavior. Right? The focus rather is on identifying relationships between trait levels in a group to some other variable or variables. So what usually happens is people will use trait theory to make predictions based on normative comparisons. That means based on group data. So trait theorists are interested in, okay, if I look at a large group of people and I measure agreeableness, how much are they kind of nice and amenable to suggestions and willing to do things for you. And then if I can get a measure of that trait, and then I can look at, I asked them for $1, how many of them give me $1? And if I see a relationship, okay, that's the kind of interesting stuff for trait theorists. And they're not looking for just one individual, they're looking at the group. Within this group, does this trait predict some behavior? Now other people may then go back and say, okay, now that you've established some relationship, right, and I've gotten kind of the average level of agreeableness, then somebody might come in and give you a personality test, see where you fall, again, in that normal distribution. So where you fall compared to others, which that's all a normative comparison is, compared to the norm, compared to the average. Are you average, are you above average, are you below average? And then based on that, they may try to make a prediction about how agreeable you are, how giving you are, how whatever it is we've measured you are. And that's often how personality tests are used. But again, that's an application of the theory. The theorists themselves aren't usually interested in individuals. They're interested in groups. And if I know about all these people, if I know about this trait, how does that relate to behavior and how does it relate to other traits? Okay. Another reason that we don't talk about trait theory is because there's really not a unified view on personality development, right? And there are trait theorists, researchers, who look at questions of why some individuals are higher or lower on the continuum of some trait or traits. Right? So people say, okay, well, why are some people more agreeable than others? Or how did people get to be agreeable? But it's focused on a particular trait. But there isn't a trait theory about, in general, how do people end up to be high or low on any particular on traits Why, what makes people more traded than others? There's no theory about that. For each individual theory, there's different explanations. Okay, well, here's the reason why some people are more agreeable than others. Here's the reason why some people are more conscientious to others than others. But those are typically different explanations, different theories, and they're working kind of in separate camps. So there's not a unified theory about how people come to have these traits, right? Which most of the other personality theories we've talked about really focus a lot on personality development, how you came to be this way. Even going back to Freud, think about, it's because of your relationship with your mother, your parents when you were a child, and this is how you came to be this person. Trait theorists don't seem to care too much how you came to be this person. They're more interested in simply describing how you are, how groups of people are, and then trying to predict behavior based on the knowledge of those traits. Similarly, no unified view on personality change, right? So different opinions about why some people might experience an increase or decrease in a trait depending on what that trait is. So again, for any particular trait, there may be some research saying, okay, well, here's how you get to be more extroverted. Here's why some people become more introverted over time. But there's not a theory across traits that tells you why people become more or less of something after they've reached adulthood. So instead of looking to confirm or disconfirm if change occurs as the ego matures, traits researchers simply ask, why might change occur? And they look to other theories generally for predictions to guide their change. So it's not a trait theory. They steal from other theories when they do try to predict change. Okay. Now let's talk a little about the development of trait theories, kind of a historical overview. Because to understand the approach now, it's important to look at how it developed. Right? So we have to start this conversation with Gordon Allport, one of the early figures. And Allport believed that not all traits were created equally, right? Not equally important or prominent in each individual. Some traits, he thought, were fairly peripheral, right? So the typical behavior, much of the time for a person, but not all the time. That's, for certain traits, situation might be more important than those traits, right? So I like to be on time, but it's not a major deal for me, right? But then it's not that certain traits are always secondary. It's like, oh, well, punctuality. Well, that's a secondary trait. Well, no, it's kind of very individualized for Allport. It might be a secondary trait for you, but not for somebody else, right? And then, so that's the secondary traits. Then he also conceptualized these things called central traits, right, which were characteristics that were important to a person's self-concept and were very typical of that person. Right, so this is kind of, well, if being on time is really important to you and you're always on time, then that might be a central trait for you. Again, what's central for you might be secondary for somebody else. So a very individualized approach to looking at personality. And then the third type he talked about was rare, cardinal traits. Right? Cardinal traits, rarely found in individuals, occur whenever a person is best understood by a single trait. And typically, he said, people are best understood by a combination of central traits. Right? That's for most people. If we know what your central traits are, we've got a good idea of who you are. But then for some people, all you need to know is this one cardinal trait. Right? It's one distinguishing characteristic that stands out above all else and seems to drive almost all of their behavior. Right? So think about people like Gandhi. You don't talk about, Gandhi's sense of humor. So funny. You talk about, passive resistance, right? And maybe patience or strength, but there's kind of this core trait of that person that is how he's understood. Or going a different direction, Charlie Sheen, self-destruction might be a trait that would be cardinal. That seems to best explain most of that person's behaviors. Right? And for Allport, this is really a rejection of psychodynamic theories. Right? They believe that people could be consciously aware of the determinants of their behavior. Right? So remember, for psychodynamic, even the Freudian and the Neo-Freudians, for a lot of the stuff that you didn't know why you were doing it. Right? You're being defensive, and you don't know why you're being defensive. It's occurring often at the reasons are at an unconscious level. Popper said, no, you know why you're doing what you're doing, and you know what kind of person you are. Okay? And then Henry Murray came along, doing a lot of his work at the same time as Allport. Talked about needs and presses. Right? So in this is where traits are conceptualized in terms of strength of personal needs. For example, the need for power or the need for affiliation. So you use different terms, but still talking about the same thing. And then presses were kind of situational demands. So needs, in Murray's language, are traits, and presses are situational demands, or the environment. He was influenced a good deal by Carl Jung, right, which is one of the Neo-Freudians. He talked a lot more about the unconscious than Allport. You can also see some Freud in his work in terms of libido and thanatos being kind of parallels for need for affiliation, or for libido, or need for power, aggression for thanatos. Which sounds kind of similar to Freud's drive model, that you need to do these things, and Freud saying you're driven to do these things. But for Henry, there was an emphasis on individual differences in these drives or needs, right? Where Freud is more like, people are like this. Henry said people are different, and they have different levels, kind of like, if you use Freudian language to talk about Henry Murray, you would say people have different levels of drives, rather than we all have, this libidinal drive. You talk about you have different levels of libidinal drive, which his words would be different levels of need for affiliation. Okay. Okay, so Allport and Murray were two of the early ones, and then the real kind of groundswell that's driven the popularity of trait theory has been the development of a statistical technique, factor analysis. Right. So here's where a major shift in how traits are studied and conceptualized occurred, because rather than using just observations in theory to determine what the essential traits were, which is what Allport and Murray mostly did, they said, okay, well, I've talked to all these people, I've looked at all these things, and here, these are the traits, and here's what I'm going to call them. Right, which you can imagine leaves lots of room for personal bias, and you have a very kind of theory that may fit that person's understanding of the world, but may not fit with other people's understandings of the world. Along comes factor analysis, and it's this data analytic technique that reveals patterns of relationships among data. So basically, you can ask people a bunch of questions, and some of the questions might be correlated, right? They might have something in common. For example, they might all reflect some latent variable. And in factor analysis language, they all load on the same factor. Right? And factor analysis can be used to determine how many factors are reflected by some large group of questions or observations. Right? So if I ask you 100 questions and 5 of them are about friendliness, if everybody answers all those 5 questions in the same way, so if somebody says, okay, I'm very friendly, and then I ask another question that's worded a little differently, and they look very friendly on that, another one. So now I've got 5 different questions, and they all are answered the same way. Then all those 5 questions represent a factor. Right? And that's what factor analysis does. It takes a bunch of questions together and says, okay, and what other questions? Maybe there's some other question that you asked that isn't obviously friendliness, but however people answered those 5 questions, they also answered this question in the same direction, and so it's loading on that factor. Now you got to figure out, what is that factor? And factor analysis won't tell you what the factor is. All I'll tell you is all these questions are answered the same. People that score high on this question also score high on these other 3 or 4. People that score low on these 5 also score low on these 5. Right? So, using factor analysis, Cattell, one of the first to apply the technique to the study of personality, it had been used elsewhere for other things. Cattell, studied under Spearman, who was studying intelligence using factor analysis for that. But Cattell generated 16 different personality factors, which is a pretty big number. Hans Eysenck came along and said, I use factor analysis, and I only found 3. And these 3 are sufficient to explain differences in people. And then Goldberg came along and said, and some others also, said, I found 5 in a 5-factor solution. So we talk about it. So dividing up personality into 5 major factors, 5 major traits, is the most popular solution currently. Not necessarily Goldberg's factors. People differ on exactly what to call the 5 factors, because again, factor analysis won't name the thing for you. All it tells you is these things bunch together and these things bunch together, and that's all it does. It's not it's a data analytic technique. It's not a thinking, rational, sentient being. But some variant of this five-factor solution is still the most popular approach in trait theory right now. Okay. But still, you got to wonder, why have people gotten different numbers? Well, factor analysis is supposed to be an atheoretical approach, right? Well, the data will tell us what's there. But it's not atheoretical, because what factors you get depend on what? Well, they depend on what data you put in. What questions you ask, right? So what questions you ask are largely influence what kind of factors you generate. And also, some other kind of technical stuff. There are different types of factor analysis which can influence the number of factors generated in terms of, an oblique rotation or orthogonal rotation, all these other statistical mumbo-jumbo things that are vague and mushy for most of us. But important to know that there's these different things that people do out there, because it influences how many factors you get and what those factors are. So it's not strictly this kind of cold mathematical thing that can reveal truth. It's still influenced by the human decisions being made about how to do the tests and what questions to ask. But again, that's a five-factor solution is the most popular. One popular five-factor solution is the Big Five. Easy to remember using the acronym OCEAN. And again, disagreements about what to call these, but again, because this one's easy to remember, it's the one I always talk about. Includes openness, which is about openness to experience, imaginativeness, curiosity, for people who are high in openness, and then low would be people who are more conservative, more dogmatic, conscientious, people who are high degrees of self-control, discipline, organization, people who are lower. Again, depending on how you look at it, it might be thought of as messy and kind of late all the time. It might also be thought of as free-spirited, right? What's the difference there? Either way, you're low in conscientiousness. Extroversion, having to do, as we think often, in terms of being kind of outgoing, but also assertive is an aspect of aggression, versus people who are more reserved, but also low levels of extroversion associated with independence, being fine, being alone. Agreeableness, high levels being trusting and sympathetic, versus being skeptical and competitive. Neuroticism, also sometimes called negative affect. High levels of neuroticism associated with experiences of negative emotion. Low levels of neuroticism associated with more positive emotions and more emotional stability. So those are the big five, but then a lot of people think that it's important, okay, those are five, but just knowing where somebody is on each of those five, not enough. What we really need to look at are the subscales, because there are different facets of these things. And it kind of gets with that. These are good often for describing people, describing groups of people, but when you get to an individual person, knowing that they're high in conscientiousness may not tell you enough, because being high in conscientiousness in general, well, there are different aspects of conscientiousness. And just because you're high generally doesn't mean you're high in all aspects of conscientiousness, right? So conscientiousness may not be fully unidimensional. It may be a multidimensional trait. Right? So there are different facets to it. So you may be low conscientious in terms of organization, have a very messy room, but high conscientious in terms of punctuality. Right? And those are both aspects of conscientiousness. And usually people are, if they're high in punctuality, they're high in being neat, but not always. People can be high in one and low in the other. It does happen. Okay. And there's, like I said, still some controversy about what to call these things. And despite the empirical support, not everyone buys into the five-factor solution at all. And that's largely because of the people can't agree on what to call the things. Because, well, usually has to do with probably ego, and people that come up with certain names say, well, I come up with this name, I think it's good, and other people come back and say, well, I didn't come up with it, so I think it's no good. And some of it goes beyond that, but a lot of it is just academics being academics. Okay. Speaking of controversy, one of the big controversies in personality research is the situation versus trait controversy. Okay? And Walter Mischel's writings played a big part in fanning the flames of this debate. Right? And what Mischel did was reviewed published studies on the correlations between traits and behavior. Right? So anything people had written about measuring openness, consciousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, and then people, if they also measured some observable behavior and found a correlation between the two, he looked at those studies and put the numbers together. Right? And what he said was the correlations are very small. Right? And he also suggested that the correlations didn't seem consistent across situations, didn't always find consistent correlations. Right? So he said that traits were not good predictors of behavior. There was low consistency across situations, so agreeableness might predict giving in one situation, but it might not predict giving if measured in a different situation. Right? And he concluded that the situation was more important, and he argued that traits are either of relatively little importance or that they perhaps do not exist at all. And this obviously really pissed off a lot of trait researchers, right? Like, you think our work is crap, that these things don't exist? And they got very mad. And so they generated a response. And since their response, well, I'll get to that. Let's just talk about their response first. Their response. They said, well, part of the reason for the low correlations is inadequate measurement techniques that were not measuring behavior well enough. That in many of the studies, they're not sampling enough behavior. Kind of like I said before, where if you look at one instance of behavior and in a trait, you're going to find low correlations. You have to find lots of measures of that behavior because traits are about how you typically are, how you on average are, not in every single instance how you are. Right? So argued the research that was conducted didn't measure behavior well, and maybe not even didn't measure the traits very well. Didn't ask enough questions to get a good idea of where someone was on a trait. Also argued that people may differ in traitedness, right? Which is akin to Murray's ideas to some degree. That for some, the kind of central trait versus secondary. For some people, being extroverted may be very important to them. So they're highly traded, and not only high in extroversion, but they're also traded in that. For someone else who's extroverted, but it's not very important to them, they may be less traded in extroversion. Right? So you may need to think about when you're measuring and saying, okay, well, does this trait predict this behavior? Depends on how traded that person is, and you have to measure that as well. Last kind of piece of the response is that the importance of small correlations is somewhat subjective. Even if we can only account for 10% of the variance in some set of behaviors using a measure of one trait, which you would be doing if you got a correlation of about 0.3, this may be important, right? And we need to do research on the effects of applying this knowledge to see if it really is important. So if we find that, okay, there's this kind of low correlation between agreeableness and giving. If the correlation is small, we can't say, okay, the correlation is small, it's not important. What we do is we think there's a relationship here. Now if we try to apply that knowledge, is it useful to us? Then yeah, okay, that was an important finding. If you can't apply the knowledge, then it may not have been an important finding. Okay? So the conclusion to all this, and not that there is a final conclusion, the debate does go on to some degree, there is evidence for stability of personality, and it can predict behavior if measured well. It can't predict it perfectly, but it predicts it better than Mischel made it seem. Still, Mischel was right to caution that that we must be careful when using personality measurements to make decisions. Right? We've got to be sure that we've got good measurement and that we're applying them appropriately. Okay. So the debate continues, and people recognize that the situation does have a lot of importance, but traits probably are still a real thing. But if you don't do a really good job of measuring them and are very careful about your application, you're going to have errant conclusions. So how do these things get applied? Real world today. There's more acceptance of using applying trait theory in the workplace now than before, especially since the development of the Big Five and all the research that's been built up behind it. But people should be careful about using some of these measurements, and most of them are developed specifically for a workplace. And some psychologists typically get paid big bucks to develop these measures, vet them, and then apply them. And often they do a very good job of telling employers about an employee, about whether or not they might be a good manager or not, if they're a good hire or not, if they're a good fit for this job that requires lots of independent thinking and creativity, if they're a good fit for this job that requires them to follow orders all the time. Right? But from just talking to other people in the business world, I found that most of them feel that these things can be helpful, but they should never be the only data point when making a decision about who to hire, who not to hire, who to promote, who not to promote. Because again, these things are used, they're most effective at being right about groups of people. Okay, so if I know this, most people will be like this, but if it's most people, that means that it's going to be wrong sometimes, right? So sometimes it takes a personality inventory, and it says, okay, it looks like you would not be a good manager. Right? And for people that got that person's test results, maybe 90% of people who got those test results would be bad managers. You say, wow, that's a really good test. And it is a really good test, except for those 10% of people who would have been good managers. Right? And that's where you have to have some other data points coming in to make those decisions. But still, they're being used more and more, especially whenever there are lots of applicants for a position, and you need a way to weed it down to a smaller number without interviewing every single person and collecting lots of data. That's a fast way to say, okay, if we can cut out all these people, we're going to be wrong about some, but whoever's left in, we're pretty confident we're right about. The other big application would be self-report inventories. Used usually for, used in a lot of settings, but largely in hospitals and clinics. The two big ones, the MMPI-2 and the PAI. The MMPI is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and the PAI is the Personality Assessment Inventory. Both paper and pencil measures, which are also can be taken on the computer now. MMPI, you answer, I think, true, false, and the PAI, you have these descriptors, and you say, not at all like me, somewhat like me, to, very much like me, a Likert type scale. And based on these, couple hundred questions on each of these tests, you can generate a variety of scales by combining certain questions. And usually of most interest to psychologists or their mental health care workers are the clinical scales that talk about level of depression, of anxiety, of in the PAI looking at certain traits consistent with the personality disorders in terms of narcissism, antisocial personality traits, things like that. But there's all other kind of scales that you can look at too. Some of which the tests were designed for. So they wrote the questions, said, okay, these questions are going to go on the scale. And some people have kind of discovered the scales after the fact. They've looked at the data. People gave these tests to other people, and they said, okay, well, geez, these questions all seem to be answered the same way, and they seem to reflect this. Right? So they're almost as if this latent variable was discovered in the test that the original test writers didn't intend, but some evidence for the utility of those scales as well. And when these things are used, like we talked before, they're usually used in making normative comparisons. So the tests are given to a whole lot of people, so that when you or an individual goes in to take the test, now however you answered is compared to how most people have answered. Right? And with the PAI especially, there are multiple normative populations you can be compared to. Right? So you can be compared to the community norm, which is giving the test to everybody, and how do you fall compared to everybody that's taken the test. There's also a clinical norm. How do you compare to people who come into a clinic asking for mental health help? Right? So if you look, if you're above average in depression in the community, so if average is 50 on this scale, T-scores 50 is the average, standard deviation of 10. So 2 standard deviations above the mean would be 70 T. So high would be up at 65, 70 T. 50 is average, below 50 would be below average. If you're at like 60 T on the depression scale, the community, you may be down. If we then take your same scores and you apply the clinical norms, you may be down at 40 T. You may be below average for somebody coming into a clinic. So you're above average for the community, but still way below average for somebody coming into a clinic. Okay. Which can be useful information. You say, well, you look depressed, but now if we compare you to the clinical population, depression isn't your main problem. But maybe for compared to people coming to a clinic, your anxiety is up at 70T. If so, your community is probably at 90T. Now we know, okay, you are more depressed than most people, but that's not your main deal. Compared to people coming in for help, you're really, really anxious. Right? Then other kinds of normative groups you can look at, police officers, people who have been convicted of crimes. The list goes on and on. The more the test is given, the more normative comparisons we can make. One of the cool things about these inventories and what makes them useful is you can look at a lot of stuff other than just the content of the answers people give. Right? Okay, so how high or low you are on these different scales, which usually reflect traits to some degree, some state stuff, some trait stuff. We can also look at things like response tendencies, right? So if you're going in and you're putting, true, 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 or very true of me on everything, the test can kick a number back saying, okay, you always said yes, or you always said no. It can, or you answered randomly. It can pick up on that. It can pick up on if you're faking good or faking bad. If you're trying to look better than you really are. Oh, I'm fine, everything's fine, I'm happy. The tests have questions built in that can help detect that. And basically because they'll look at people who have no motivation to try to look good. And they have questions in there that most people will admit to these kind of minor faults. But when you're trying to look good, you won't admit to even these minor things. And so you'll say, oh, yes. And the test will go, oh, you said yes to this. Nobody says yes to that. You're lying. Also, people may come in faking bad. Usually for like workman's comp stuff or trying to get out of some duty of some kind. Oh, yeah, I have all these horrible symptoms and they're this. And there's questions in there that often aren't real symptoms or are symptoms of such severity that nobody ever endorses those when we know that they don't have a reason to lie. So if you endorse those, the test goes, oh, you're lying, you're faking bad. You're engaging in impression management. You're trying to manage the impression that you're giving me. And people will do that for a variety of reasons. Sometimes for secondary gain, to get something, to get out of something. Sometimes just because they're worried about how they're going to come across. They fake good because they don't want to be seen a certain way. They just feel uncomfortable, people knowing how sad and hurt they are. Sometimes they're worried that you're not going to know how sad and hurt they are, and that you're going to underestimate their sadness and their hurt. And so they'll fake bad. So they really are depressed, but they'll say they're very depressed to make sure and get your attention. Right? And the test can pick up on those things. And like I said before, I can also pick up on careless and idiosyncratic responding. Somebody who's just filling in the blanks, the test knows when you're doing that, because certain questions are tied together. Well, if you answer this one true, then this one should also be true, because it's veritably the same question. And if you have one true, one false, it means either you weren't paying attention or you're have some severe cognitive impairment that allows you not to fill out the test in a valid way. Okay. So lots of cool kind of validity scales built into these tests, in addition to the clinical scales and other things that measure both some state stuff, but largely they measure trait stuff, and that's why it's an application of trait theory. Okay. Evaluating the trait approach. One kind of good thing about it, arguably, is that it is an empirical approach that can reduce the impact of bias. Right? It's not based on the childhood experiences of a particular theorist. As you've probably noticed, some of their theories clearly were. Right? This theory, wow, how you feel about the people is really a reflection of your own childhood experiences with your mother or your father or your experiences in school. And you can really see kind of a theorist's personal stamp on a theory. And trait theory is not that. Right? So in that way, less personal bias creeps in. But remember, there's no purely atheoretical approach. So even though trait theory has potential for less bias, what traits people identify and what questions they ask to identify those traits still is influenced by their own personal biases. Another good thing, has many popular applications. Right? A lot of the assessments that we use in personality assessment are based on the trait approach, and they're used in a variety of fields. Clinical work, also in education, in the workplace, in probably growing popularity as the tests get better and more data supports their use. In terms of maybe a weakness, the explanation of development, how personality develops. There is none. Right? Trait theory doesn't say how you get to be extroverted or introverted, because that's not a question that concern the people who develop the approach. So if you kind of adopt a trait theory approach, you still, if you want to understand personality development, you've got to come at it from some other angles, using some other theory of personality that you can maybe incorporate with a trait approach. And there are still ongoing controversies, as we said. A debate about the number of factors, what's appropriate, what they mean, what they should be called. And as I said before, it's not really a theory so much as an approach to studying personality. Right. Overall, despite any limitations, you'll certainly see the influence of trait theory on all the other theories we'll talk about. Anytime a theorist talks about someone being high or low with regard to some characteristic, this is the influence of trait theory. Right. So even if somebody kind of goes back to Freudian stuff and talks about or object relation stuff, somebody's being high in ego strength, right? So if they conceptualize ego strength as something you can be high or low in, and that maybe it's potentially a normally distributed trait, well, that's trait theory being applied to a Freudian concept. Okay, that's all for now.